All right. I'm so excited. Welcome back, y'all, to the second full-length episode. I've done a little ones before of General Ed Kids Deserve Geography too. I've got some brilliant, great new guests here with us who we're going to introduce ourselves to each other. Got lots to talk about. Today's subject matter is environmental geography, especially around natural catastrophes and climate change, those sorts of things. So we'll just go one at a time. We've got Logan and Jia today, and you both have worked out on the West Coast, which is something I am not literate in. So I'm really glad to have you all here today. So Logan, you want to introduce yourself, then Jia, and we'll just go from there.
Sure thing. Yeah, my name's Logan Swanson. I was a 6-year wildland firefighter in Montana. And after that, I did geography work in the Arctic Circle, which paid for my education in GIS, Geospatial Information Systems. And that then took me to Atlanta, where I am working at the Atlanta, Georgia Department of Transportation.
Dude, you worked at the Arctic Circle?
I did. I forgot if I had told you about that or not. That was no 86 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
How'd you pass the time?
That's me. Oh, just wanting to be anywhere else.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, quick introduction. My name is Jia. I am a director of geospatial services for a renewable energy company called Arthur Renewables. I've been in utility scale solar development for the last 4 years now. Prior to that, I was the GIS manager for the Water Resources Division of the National Park Service. And then prior to that, I did my education, got my master's degree in GIS. I initially got introduced to GIS through work experience in Montana. I was working as an intern as a wildlife biologist for the Lewis and Clark National Forest, where we had to utilize GIS in a lot of habitat mapping, specifically for northern goshawk surveys. And so that's kind of how I got introduced to GIS, really enjoyed its application and thought that I ought to, maybe go back to school and learn a thing or two. And now here I am in the renewable energy space.
Damn.
Very cool.
I'm just a geography teacher. I used to work for public school system. That's it. Dang, you guys are really out there doing it. Can I ask, do you both do you consider yourselves a geographer by trade? Like, is that what you refer to yourself as, among other things? But
go ahead.
Yeah. So for me, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a geographer. That's just never been kind of my area, although geography has had tremendous impact in the way that I do work. And so in my current position with Arthur Renewables, and same thing with Lightsource BP, I was much more of a project manager / solar developer. And so because I have these GIS skills, it was really easy for me to leverage GIS in terms of developing project risks and how we ought to develop our projects around those risks or mitigate around those risks. So not so much a geographer, but definitely very integrated in my day-to-day.
I think I'm similar. Right now, I actually work more on the data side than the geography side. To my detriment, I'd much more prefer to work in the geography side and that sort of mapping. But right now, I'm more mapping data. But in my career as a wildland firefighter, I considered myself a sort of like layman geographer because we kind of had to learn on the trade all these things that I wasn't taught in school about, gullies and funnels and mountain habits and all these things that I had no idea about. And so it might not have been something I said, sort of in my job title or anything, but it was something that I used often.
Cool. We all just met and we're talking about it, but it sounds like, and y'all correct me here, like if you had worked in the same place, do you think like career-wise your jobs, like you two would have intersected at some point to begin with? Because John, didn't you also tell me you've worked in hydrology before as well?
So I haven't necessarily worked specifically in hydrology. What I've done is a lot of mapping and working with engineers to evaluate our NatCat exposure as it relates to flooding. And so working with insurance brokers in order to make sure that our projects can be insured. And so previously when I was at Lightsource BP, I worked on a project called Venture Solar, which was actually located in an oxbow, right by an oxbow lake of the Mississippi River in Louisiana. And of course, in that area, due to climate change, we're seeing a whole lot more of these named windstorms, a lot more rain. And so we're seeing a lot more flood risk in those areas. And so definitely working with the hydrologist, right? Modeling our, what we call the H&H model, which is the hydrological and hydraulics model, which gives you a prediction of flood depths and also velocity as it relates to scour potential, in order to make sure that we're engineering our solar layouts to withstand a certain, to have that tolerance for those natural catastrophe exposures. And that in turn also informs those decisions that are being made downstream in the project insurance side. Because up to now, I will tell you that that particular project was really one of a kind, because no other solar projects at the utility scale was ever able to actually get project insurance in that area. And so in the southern southeast area of Louisiana, that's the first of its kind. And because we've done extensive modeling and scenario analysis and partnered with our insurance broker, we were actually able to construct something that can withstand even 500-year flood events.
Yeah, I would say for people who are a little unaware of what GIS is, it's sort of the merging of natural environments and mapping cartography in computer systems. So what we both have in common is we're taking the natural environments and we're putting it into a machine, and we're using that to analyze and come up with different things. And so I think there's a lot of commonality, actually. I worked in Glacier Park as a firefighter, and we had a GIS department there. They were mapping fire intensity, and so they would map how fast, how far a fire would burn, and then they would also use that data to see how it would affect populations of wildlife later on. When I was in the Arctic Circle, I was mapping ice strength by driving over it with a ground penetrating radar. And so that was to test and see how strong this ice is, how deep it is, and if it was possible to get heavier equipment over it. And there's really no way to do that other than to get a person out in the field and just see what you can see with your different technologies. And then with fire mapping, it's the same thing, only it's a lot more critical, because you're dealing with an ongoing emergency operations system, and you have firefighters in the field. Every day you get a new data packet, a new handout with your briefing and all that, and there's a map in the back. And if that's not accurate, you can be sending your people into a dangerous situation. And so it's just sort of the merging of the natural environment and the computers.
That's really interesting to me. As it relates to kind of like fire mapping,
Mhm.
have you guys done a lot of predictive models too? Because I mean, I imagine, with climate change, how dry it has been out west for us, right? That it has, probably a pretty, detrimental impact on
Oh, certainly.
fire. Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I got my degree and then I came to Atlanta, so I haven't used it out in Montana as much. But my senior thesis sort of thing was a model of a subdivision where I grew up in a small town of Sealy Lake, and they had a proposed subdivision, and I analyzed it with regards to my state's fire safety regulations of, like, do you have more than one entrance and exit? Do you have water nearby? Are you built on a slope? Are you built near gas lines? Are you built near trees? And I found that out of, I think, 120 houses that were proposed, 110 of them were in critical danger the minute they were even construction started. Like, this is, this is data that they don't really see because they just see the money and free space. But like, if a fire were to come through there, critical danger immediately.
Mm-hmm. And that's amazing to me, because I think we're seeing a lot of those types of changes in our space right now, in terms of just insurance brokerage and also modeling based on climate change. So much has changed in the last 20 or so years that even the insurance brokers, they are not only looking at the 100-year floodplains anymore, but they're also looking at even something as far out as 500-year. Just like with wildfire, with residential property insurance, I'm seeing here in Colorado that that's typically not covering a typical home insurance policy anymore. If you
Right.
choose to live near, the mountains, that's a completely separate policy. And there's a lot of mitigation efforts, the onus falling on the landowner before
Right.
you can even get insured. And so you're definitely seeing this trend within the insurance market, just general hardening of the
Mhm.
insurance market, making it really difficult for us to actually acquire insurance for not just projects, but also residential development because of these climate change impacts.
Yeah, we had a small one in the Arctic Circle where they're moving. I forget what the river is called, but they move a lot of equipment over a river, and it's frozen. And we're doing this in March, so the window is shrinking, and they're doing all these calculations. And I had the honor of telling them, like, "Hey, I have moving water on this river. You need to move your vehicles." And it was something like $2 million worth of vehicles that are in potentially could go completely into the water because their timetables were just off.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love what you're all talking about here about the sort of responses, not just to these sorts of climate change and the changing conditions. In a high school setting, we often get stuck at like, hey, this is a thing, right? Like, and here's the data sets and this is what it looks like. But there's no magic school bus. I'd love to take them to the Arctic Circle tomorrow. You know what I'm saying? Like, and what does $2 million of equipment sinking to a bottom of the river look like? And what does moving that look like, sort of thing? But something you both kind of touched on is the sort of responses before the event even occurs. Not just insurance, but I love that you're talking about the economic elements as well, how we shape society around environmental factors. But you said a lot of that stuff falls on the homeowner. The sorts of things that we have to be literate in a geographically changing world all the time. Because insurance ain't always going to be there anyway. I'm sure you've seen in Florida, a lot of insurance companies don't even want to insure properties anymore because it's all going away. There's nothing there to sustain for a long period of time. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but when I teach about GIS to ninth graders, when they're 14, 15 years old, the way I simplify it is layers of variables, layers of data, and then I make them identify the sort of, if we were to stack it on top of each other, what would you need? So it's really excellent to hear this sort of much more expansive understanding of what that data is and what you do with it. So I've mentioned to you both before, and you all both seemed like kind of aware already about the removal of geography from high schools, and the country over, really in more than just the U.S. Logan, when I mentioned it to you, you made the funniest face. You were like, what the absolute... what do your lives and your professions look like with less geographically literate generations coming up behind us? Well, like, what does that do for you? Like, Jia, you had mentioned a little bit to me about literally the geography program at your university is shrinking because there's not enough people taking it, so you need less professors. What does y'all's world look like, and how might your world personally be different if there's less geographically literate populace coming up behind us? Whichever one of you wants to jump in first.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I will say that in the renewable energy space, of course, it's a really exciting time for our industry, and we're definitely ramping up in terms of even government incentives and state level incentives for, increasing our kind of energy independence by going renewable. So much of our success is based on how we go ahead and site our projects. And all of those things have a geography component, have a spatial component. The risks that we need to understand before we can actually make sure that a project is viable is very spatially dependent. We see certain regions, for example, places like PA and Virginia, even though they may be really hot markets, with great tax incentives, great project economics, you need to be aware of all of the different, types of topography that exist there. You have a lot of land cover issues out in those areas. And then, in the Midwest, places like Kentucky and Indiana, Illinois, even though those are very hot areas right now in terms of the market space, you have issues like, flooding, you have issues like karst, geology, right? You have potential for sinkholes to exist. And so a lot of these things are very, kind of spatially related. And it takes geographers really to understand the types of risks that may exist even throughout, the US, because the geographic regions that we're dealing with have different risks. In order to successfully plan and mitigate for those risks, you need to understand how those environmental risks may impact a project and how they differ amongst our landscape. So not having geographers makes building projects all the more difficult and almost impossible.
Yeah.
Dangerous as well, I imagine.
Very dangerous.
Absolutely.
Can I follow up on that real quick? Have you personally, in any of your work, had to deal with someone who was really demanding something of you and had no understanding of, like, actually, if we do this, it's going to be catastrophic?
I think that's kind of common, right? Like in our day to day, where people demand things that are just impractical, and mostly just stems from, right, a lack of knowing, right? But yeah, I've seen in the private sector, it can be very high stake, very high pressure. I remember in my previous job at Lightsource BP, there was a lot of push to make some of our Pennsylvania projects work. But then in order to make Pennsylvania projects work, a lot of times there's a lot of civil costs, a lot of grading costs, because the terrain is so steep. But then if you modify the terrain, of course, you're going to have hydrology issues. And, also the EPA regulates, the NPDES, right, program. And so the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So you have to obey by certain discharge or outpour points. And so it causes a lot of issues if we were to go ahead and grade the site. And so it's not ever that simple, right? And people think, oh, just make it flat, it'll be fine. It's never that simple, right?
Just make it flat.
Right. And making it flat actually causes other issues too that people don't seem to understand. So it's never that simple. And a lot of times when I work with, more junior developers, that's the kind of thing that they hired me for, right? It's to help them understand how some of these environmental factors, it's not just as easy as just grading the site. When you grade the site, you have to restudy your hydrology. And also making it too flat has the potential for ponding, what we call pluvial flooding, right? And so pluvial flooding can then impact how much we need to elevate our trackers and our solar panels to keep the electrical out of risk from, being too close to the water. And so it's all of these things that are just, integrated, they're correlated. And so yes, I've been asked. And so this is kind of the normal spiel that I kind of go through with some of those people that ask.
And Logan, so now you've got two questions. What's a geographically illiterate world in your any of the things that you've done? You've told me some really wild stories about your wildfire days.
Well, I would call myself geographically illiterate right now. I did not have a good education growing up. And most of what I was taught out of classrooms, and it was taught, working with ranchers or working on a farm, that kind of thing. It was all practical experience, and it really wasn't enough. It was always fascinating to me. But when I became a firefighter, it wasn't for my knowledge. It was, can you show up and not be hungover? Can you lift a thing? Can you put a thing down? Can you drive a car? And, they sort out who can do that and who in that cattle call of fresh meat is worth, raising up the ranks. And so everything I learned about fire and geography is taught on the job, and it's taught de facto, not nobody here has a degree. It's the guys who've been doing the job a long time. And so when I achieved a leadership role, one of the first things my crew boss said, he took me away from the rest of the group and he brought me up onto this ridge, and we were looking out at a fire, and he said, you need to learn how to read a mountain. You need to learn how to read an environment. And this is critical. Like we need to have geography. He wasn't saying it, but we need to know what it is. And so just looking through my old notes, and it's like, it's all there, but it's all sort of layman stuff. You need to find safety zones. You need to find trouble spots. You need to find helicopter landing spots and areas where you can retreat to, and all these sorts of things that if you had a basic geography understanding, it would be a lot easier for you. I fought with a helicopter team for 2 years, and we would fly out to these random places. And one of my favorites is when we would go out in Billings. They have these kind of buttes and kind of dead dry lands, and it was just a totally different biome that I'm just completely unfamiliar with. And I would be thrilled because it's like school's in session. Like, let's see what's going on out here. And I mean, the first geographical, like, formal education I got was getting my GIS certificate at 33. And I still consider myself, uneducated in the field. I am working with these people who have master's degrees and associate's degrees, and I have a technical certificate from a tribal college. And I want to do fire mapping, and they're doing enormous projects, and there's a lot of imposter syndrome there. So I consider myself one of those people. I think any knowledge that could have been passed down to me would have benefited me. And so, yeah, I just didn't have it growing up.
I'm glad you mentioned all that, because one, you're brilliant. And, to hear like how we perceive ourselves, and how we value where knowledge comes from and that sort of stuff. One of the things I spoke about in the first episode about the removal of geography from high schools is, like, we don't become literate in this material until significantly later in life. And then that has cost too, that we are still parsing the vocabulary and the impacts as this shit's hitting us in the face, learning the job on the fly, literally thrown into the fire during wildfire season is not like at the top of my list,
Yeah, not the ideal way to do it.
And not fair to that same extent, but also recognize, like, just going into it is really the way that we learn the real shit in life is to just be thrown into that. And you can make all the maps you want, but if you can't do anything about it, it's like, who cares?
Absolutely.
And it also, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in the time that I've spent in the GIS field, what I've come to also realize is that the value add is not really necessarily in, like in the GIS field. Sure, you can have the fundamentals, you can deal with the data, but the real value is by, what kind of conclusions can you draw, right, from that data? Just because you know how to overlay things, you need to understand how do we extract these conclusions to inform decision making. And that's the power, right, of the geography. It provides us with this ability to look at things in a spatial framework and look at multiple variables that may be correlated, and then, make decisions that way. And so I think that, there's a lot of people here, I think, in our field that know how to point and click in GIS, but understanding geography, I think, is very different, and how that really can translate to decision making. And I think that's the power.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also add that it's not just in commercial fields or emergency fields. It's in everything. Like, once I realized, like, put a name to it of, like, I'm really interested in geography, and we started to learn about our indigenous areas that I grew up in. And it turns out that the valley I grew up in, that I was born and raised in this house, it was a meeting point for Salish Kootenai tribes traveling over the Continental Divide after buffalo hunting in the Dakotas. And so they would meet in this really large valley. And we have this row of hills that stretch out from our property. It's only a half acre, but it stretches out from there to the Blackfoot River. And there are these little cairns on top of each hill. And I always wondered, like, what is that? And finally we got a Salish archaeologist out there, and he said, oh, I know what this is. This is when they would meet, and the tribes would meet, and they would process the buffalo, and they would, share stories and all that. They would send the kids up to the hills, and they'd have these little cairns, and they'd have these little fires ready to start. And when the kid that was closest to the water saw the Blackfeet coming down in war canoes, they would light a fire, and then the next hill over would see that fire and light a fire and light a fire. And it's, we have the geological evidence of watchfires from who knows how long ago. And, it was just something interesting to me, but the history is so much deeper and so much cooler.
That's really rad.
Yeah.
Not that, like, kids like, oh, here they come to kill us, but, like, just,
yeah.
the archaeology of it and the systemization of geography is ancient,
Mhm.
how to operate in the world.
Yeah. One of the first maps I made was actually a map of my little area that we grew up in, and there were the watchfires, and then there were stashed teepee poles where tribes would let others know, like if you're in a coming through and you need a place to rest, there's teepee poles that are stashed here. And of course, they didn't have maps, or maybe they did. I'm not as literate in native times as I should be, but they would know, like, at this reservoir there's some teepee poles that are stashed. And then the other thing I mapped was these artifacts called scar trees, where in hard winters natives would peel off the layer of bark and get at a softer layer of bark underneath it and eat that for sustenance. And you can see hatchet marks, and you can see, knife marks, and who knows how old that is.
Something I want to mention, just to clarify, is, John, you had said earlier, what we're all getting at here is, does using geography as a tool to understand, and Logan, you said it really applies to everything. Does our solution actually match the problem? And how many adults and kids, go around this and say, well, this is bad, let's do this. But there's no real understanding of, they didn't extract the data the way you were mentioning before appropriately. And you spend all this time, energy, and effort, and it turns out the thing you did doesn't actually fix the problem. What comes to mind is expanding the lanes in a highway. Does that actually solve our urban planning and city development geographical issues? It does not. But using geography as a means of both, the relationship between solution and problem. Do you really have the data to say that this solution matches the problem? And also geography, Logan was talking about there, as a vehicle for history too. Where have our processes grown from? What have they've come from? Dang, y'all are excellent, brilliant. Is there anything else that before we move on? So, like do the last 20 minutes as the lesson, and then you guys can critique and add to how to better teach youth this very stuff that we're talking about here. Anything in particular that you love? Things that you would love for ninth graders to know about that sort of thing? You talk about what you want to talk about, but I would love to hear a little bit about some of the fires that you've been in. Logan, I know you mentioned you were on a helicopter, but what's that experience like? And especially, we didn't mention industrial forests and how that's actually part of the problem.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to place students. It's important to know where you are and what your history and what your current situation is facing. And I think geography is just a great way to say, you are here. This is what's going on around you. Like, just the next time you see something interesting, this is why. This is what happens. Like, it's history. It's context. It's everything. It's the earth we walk on. It's really important to know this stuff.
I like that. It's the earth we walk on.
Yeah, I think, growing up rural as I did, it was just sort of information that was kind of passed on to me, but it was never really explained why. And so I think the education system was lacking, but the informal education is always going to be there. It's always going to fill in the gaps, but it's never going to give you everything. As much as those ranch hands and farmers, like, they've got knowledge, they just don't have academic intellect, sort of, those things.
That'd be a whole interesting conversation to have, because I deal with, like, the semi-urban, semi-suburban sort of in-between populations. They're 10 minutes away from a major metropolitan area, but it's very suburban, but, like, still population density. Be interesting there to see how, a whole discussion around the comparisons of the intake of that sort of data.
Yeah.
In those experiences.
Yeah, and I think in general, I think that if anything, teaching geography, I think that we just need to be very mindful and cognizant about just the actual application of it all, right? Like, making sure that the children really understand how what they're learning in the classroom translates to what they're seeing, in real life. When I did my graduate degree in GIS, it was a combination degree in GIS and watershed sciences. And I looked at, my thesis was on looking at various watershed characteristics that were related to the spatial correlation, right? The spatial correlation to the occurrence of just impaired waters. And we're seeing, it's easy enough to say that, oh, the occurrence of impaired waters, like for example, nutrient loading, oh, that must be because it's close to a farm. But there's more to it. There's more to it. You look at things like terrain, the physical constraints, right? But you also look at those actual social characteristics of a watershed. You look at how involved people are, what kind of socioeconomic class live in that watershed. And that actually has a big influence on water quality in general. And so, it's not ever just that simple. And we need to just, we can leverage geography to help us peel those layers, and understand what the core issues are. So then that way you can really help make decision making that are real solutions to the actual problem.
Right. I agree. I think what people need to understand is that it's a practical science. It's not something theoretical. It's not something that has no application to your life. Like, you can learn about a mountain range and then you can go out and walk in a mountain range. Like, this is important. You need to know this stuff.
Rad. All right, so I want to shift to the actual lesson part. You'll still be able to throw in on it. One thing that we didn't talk about, but will come up during this, is maybe some of your experiences with denialism, denial of climate change and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. So just to always start out with, in education, they're big on, kids needing to know where they're going to land. Like, what's the objectives and what are you trying to walk away with? So the top half here is the Georgia State standards that I built this lesson on, which is political, environmental, and economic impacts of things like industrialization and resource management and all this, renewable energy sources, development, deforestation, all these sorts of things that we've referenced and talked about today. And also assessing, analyzing, and comparing different local state responses to these sorts of things, including populations' resistance or approval of those sorts of things. This bottom part here is how I was taught to organize lessons: skill, intellect, identity, criticality. So the skill is the actual physical lesson, like the assignment, the task they're going to do. And that's going to be to compare. I give them 6 different states' responses to natural catastrophes, and they're going to watch the videos and they talk about it. They'll exchange information, but ultimately to make a meme and assessing, which states do they think are responding most effectively and which states do they think are responding poorly. The intellect portion is the science of climate change as a measurable process. Like what you guys do. How does GIS work? What information, what variables are in there? What tools can you use to put it together? Identity, I always try to make things authentic assessment in that, like, how does this relate to your actual life? Like, how do you go out in the world? And here, to start with watersheds and electricity, like, where do your resources come from here where you live? And how does the environment deliver those? And then the criticality part will be about confronting denialism and what do we do when facts don't impact people. And one of our vocabulary words last week was diffusion. And what do we do when diffusion is resisted or disrupted, and how these ideas do or do not expand over time. So the first opening, the very opener for environmental geography here is I give them these 2 maps. The one on the left is hydrology of North America, and the one on the right is watersheds. And we start with the one on the left. So, what do you kids think? What is this? What is it showing? It takes a couple of tries, but they usually figure out this looks like water. And I clarify rivers. Where's the Mississippi? Can you see the Colorado River? Questions I ask are, we often associate water source equals settlement. But what about, say, in the Canadian Shield in the northern part here, where it's so rocky and so swampy that maybe it has the opposite impact on settlement processes and stuff like that? Maybe there's less people out there. Not that there aren't people out there, especially indigenous folk. And then we spent a little more time with this one. This one they struggle with, watersheds, and I give them a vocabulary list to introduce the U.S. Geological Survey. What is a watershed? What happens to the water in that area? What do you notice about where it all ends up? And those sorts of things. So that usually ignites a little discussion. And then I move into the last video I did on the channel was a 3-minute TikTok about the actual task I have them do after these maps, where I give them a Google Earth, like I have all the physical geography things that the standards wants them to know. And they have to write a little story using Google Earth to explore like Appalachian Mountains, Rocky Mountains, Wyoming Basin, Denali, all that sort of stuff. That sort of things. You guys have any input, thoughts, or questions about, if you were a kid and somebody threw these maps at you, like what questions I could be asking or?
The one that first, go ahead, Jeff.
No, please, Logan, go ahead.
The one that first comes to mind is just looking at the hydrological map and looking at Nevada. And I'd love to get Ja's thoughts on this if we have time, about the water crisis with the Colorado River and just how bad the Southwest is going to get in a few years. And that one to me is a big deal. I also think that the Mississippi just draws the eye. Like, what a powerful river that is. That's a good starter one too.
I think that these two maps are very telling, but I also think that what's kind of in between these two maps, perhaps another graphic or map of how the terrain varies over the landscape may help them draw all of those things together.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. I will go get that.
Yeah, I think that might even be more useful than a watershed map, just because if you're, before you even get into watersheds, you got to get into where's the mountains, where's the valleys, where's the plains, Yeah, okay. I agree.
Awesome. I will absolutely add that. So before I get into the actual the thing we do in the class, this is from WAPO last year. This is a source from FEMA, but 40% of Americans live in a place that experienced climate disaster. And this is just a map on, I'm sure there's more here as well. Right. Wondering why Texas is so naked in that regard. But just to, what people are dealing with in different places. So might be a bit more widespread than they really have to consider, especially like here in the Metro Atlanta area. Like, we occasionally get a tornado. It occasionally rains really hard here. Like, drought's actually been a bigger thing in the state of Georgia more than anything else, right. Which you can see in the north here, but notably outside the city limits. So that's just introduce that. So then I have the actual task here, and I'm going to show the assignment I have with it. So I have 6 videos. One of them is actually an article, and I break the class up into groups, and they each get 2 videos, right? We don't want to overwhelm them because they're not going to watch 6 videos and know what the hell they're talking about. So the first 2 are New Jersey and Louisiana, and I give them in fact, I won't even, I have all the videos laid out here. So New Jersey, it's a PBS thing. This came out in 2019. About not just Superstorm Sandy, but the subsequent storms, and then a source on Louisiana's disappearing coast, and time, and I think I have an image of it there. This one, like how the coastline has changed over the last 100 years or so, and the New Jersey one's about like zoning and restoration and changing the zoning, and government programs, the buyout programs will like convince a whole neighborhood to sell their home back to this state agency, or this agency that takes state money or federal money, and then they'll change the zoning of the area to say like floodplain, or and then they'll plant like indigenous plants and put animals back there and stuff, and let it restore, and that actually has made a big impact on the flooding and what people are doing about in Louisiana, from home raising to moving back to setting back, or sometimes people just end up abandoning a place. The next groups would do 2 videos on Texas. One is from Vox on the winter storm that just passed in 2021, or was that 2020? It's all blurred together these last 3 years.
COVID times, I get it.
Yeah. And the other one is actually the expansion in certain parts of Texas, especially among millennials, where Republican interest is actually moving towards wind turbines, and like that there is a place for green energy, and to talk about pull factors and why people might want to live there. But also addressing the denialism, especially among older populations who say, well, I don't see it, even though I don't understand it. I think I don't see it, therefore it must not be real. and to confront those sorts of things. Like, what do you do when people don't believe fact, which is a real problem, right? Conspiratorialism and just ignorance. So they watch those 2 videos and they'll take notes. I actually give them a template as well, because when you're 15, you got to learn how to take notes, right? You say, well, what's important? What do you highlight in something? What's important? Well, how do you know it's important? So we've got things like institutions, different peoples and perspectives. I really try to hone in on like that what the government wants and different groups of people and populations want often aren't the same thing. Different statistics that are involved. And then the last one here is GIS. I want them to cite what are some variables, like what are some of those layers, like in New Jersey, population map versus flood zones, right? Like, and how to layer that together and what information can we derive from that? That's the kind of stuff you'd want. Mm-hmm. So we've got the 2 on the Texas as well. And then the last one is, thanks to Logan here, he really gave me some great insights on California. The California tribe is fighting wildfires with fire and prescriptive burns, and how industrialization of forest actually led to these mega fires that destroy entire counties, or more than that. And then I found this other article that had some great GIFs and change over time maps of the snow caps melting in the Rockies and how that's like changing the topography and the accessibility to water. You mentioned the Colorado River, and that would be the 3rd group. So different groups together, they'd watch their 2 videos, take a series of notes, fill this out, and then I do like a speed dating style, like information exchange. Like you have to find someone from the other groups and fill in your graphic organizer with that information. So that gives kids the opportunity to really demonstrate, do I know this because I can explain it to someone? Did I really get the data out of it? And then I also give them, these are some of their vocabulary: zoning, global warming, renewable energy, controlled burn, and grassroots organizations, to especially making distinction of like government agency, and that's something a little different. So that's the actual class material. I've got the actual video titles linked in the names and the sides there. Again, that's all on this material. And then they'll do the exchange. After they have that discussion, I just saw this the other day. I just threw this in here because I saw Pew Research, but definitely to drive home denialism. We want to hone in on the video in Texas that talks about people's denial, but that the left-to-right spectrum, the difference in believability of climate change is the broadest, is the largest in the U.S. Than any other developed, I hate that word, but developed nation where, there's the difference in belief about it is actually much smaller. But in the U.S., you can see here, the right is significantly less likely to believe it. Which leads us to our actual assignment then. The task that I have them do is memes. These kids, they're meme masters. It's really been hit or miss sometimes. In the past, I've had some kids who are just like, whatever, I don't care. But other times I've had kids who are like, are we really discussing the philosophical role of memes in society in a geography class? And to really drive home, this is a form of ideological diffusion, and that's how a lot of people distribute ideas now. I just picked some of the more common ones and funny ones, the easier ones for them to mess with. But they are to make a meme. I have the content here. I'll make this large again. They just have to, run it by me which meme they're doing there. Assessing one of the state's responses to climate change. I give them some content and assessment criteria. And then for number 2, they have to pick which state do you think is most effectively dealing with their problem and which state is not most effectively dealing or is least effectively dealing with their problem. And then to justify why, really explain their reasoning. Some pitfalls for teachers out there who might be interested in this that I realized the first time I did this. Despite living in the South, it's easy for them to fall into the stupid Southerner stereotype. And it's something in the future when I've gone on to do it, like, if you're going to dunk on the Texas or Louisiana governments, be real clear that that's a different need or want than the people who are suffering, right? You don't want to make fun of the people who are suffering of environmental change when it's the government who's not really handling it well, whatever that might be. Informed evaluation, comparing state responses, and then justifying the hows and the why using these means of diffusion, in this case, making memes. And that takes about 2 days. I give them about 2 days to do all that. And that is how we introduce environmental geography of North America.
I like it.
Thoughts, questions, like if you were a ninth grader, or if there's more material that you think would be stronger to add or to qualify. You guys gave me some great feedback with the first map there. I'm going to add that topography one.
I think that, the thing that kind of resonated with me a little bit was, so I grew up in South Jersey, and this project of, looking at mapping out floodplains and then being able to purchase back those structures, and then rezoning, so then that way it's more of a conservation area. I think it would be helpful to also have students look at the property values. And essentially, you can look up property values through, something as simple as, I think it's called acrevalue.com, where you can literally click on, zoom in on area and click on parcels and get a rough estimate of what that property is worth. This translates to essentially how much it does cost society in terms of our impacts on climate change and the sea level rising. You can literally quantify the financial impact that it has on society as a whole.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do talk about that, the resistance to the selling, because they only buy if you can convince a whole region, a whole parcel of land to surrender the home.
Right.
Is because, and I only learned this a couple of years ago, that one of the biggest ways for middle class mobility is to sell your home and acquire the equity. And if you feel like the government or this agency isn't buying back at a high enough value, but your value is still plummeting because of the flood issues, and it's not going to go back up anytime soon.
Right.
The population is screwed one way or the other. Absolutely. That class distinction. We talk a lot about classism in the way it is there. So glad you said that. And I'll take a look at that website you mentioned there. That the values of these homes and the values of the people living there or selling or not selling is really impactful in terms of how people respond to these sorts of things.
Right. And it all comes from taxpayer dollars.
Well, yeah. I think it's the program. It's called Blue Acres, and they take up federal government grants in order to be able to pay for it. I think that's how they do it. Go ahead, Logan.
Yeah, I was thinking about the California and the tribal situation, and I think I'm not sure exactly if you have the space or the time, but just one of the things I would love to see is just to mention that it is often tribals or indigenous people who are doing the climate stewardship. And not only are they doing it, but they've been doing it for hundreds of years. They know more than we do at this point. They always have. And climate change has been going on for a long time, and the indigenous people know how to deal with it or are observing it. And they might not have the maps, but they have the knowledge, and they might not have the data, but they have, the wisdom to deal with this sort of thing. And it's been going on for a long time. And so I think if you want to mention, if you have space for it, that is a really important point to me. I worked a lot with the native firefighting teams, and they had different sort of rules as what they would appreciate doing and what they would not, and how they would approach a wildfire versus how the rest of us would. And it's just really important to hammer home the point that we don't know the right way to do it, and we are colonizers here, and that the people who were here first already have this knowledge.
I love that. And actually, I added that video of this California tribe is fighting wildfire because of those conversations we had a few weeks ago, and it does address a lot of that material.
Okay,
so I'm
cool.
really glad that you had said that to me. I grew up in Jersey too. I grew up in a different part of Jersey, not South Jersey. But we don't have that. That was not something that was really ever brought to our attention. Not that there was. I'm not saying there wasn't large Lenape or indigenous populations out there, but it's just so erased, memory side, if you will, from our educational practices. Cool.
So another comment that I had about sorry, another comment I had about the whole Texas situation. So we do struggle between actual denialism, and I think what has also been looked at as corporate greed. And corporate greed driving denialism. And, the instance in Texas, it's not that it wasn't foreseen. There were climatic models that have predicted this sort of event. It's because I think from my personal opinion, ERCOT is a little bit different. ERCOT is essentially the independent system operator for the entire state of Texas, other than I think the northwest section of Texas. But so Texas ERCOT operates on its own as its own separate grid. And these, some of the issues that they were seeing was, number one, the freezing temperatures. It's not that they didn't know about it, but rather they chose to eliminate the Attorney General's office and the reliability aspect of ERCOT. And so there was no one really enforcing reliability or checking on that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, there were a lot of criticisms that were drawn towards the renewable energy industry as it relates to ERCOT generation, because a lot of our wind turbines in ERCOT within Texas ended up freezing and not generating. Well, that also was a choice, because we have mechanisms for wind turbines to not freeze. It's just a matter of an additional investment to kind of fail proof that kind of system. But we choose not to do that because it eats into our margins. And so, there's several things that I think, there are people that legitimately deny. But then I also think that there are people who are denying because it helps them have deeper pockets. During that crisis, because there's no reliability council for ERCOT back then, and everything was being done in the wholesale market, they were able to charge people upwards of, I think the cap was close to like $10,000 per kilowatt hour. People were ending up with 5-digit electricity bills. That's how crazy it was. And so legitimate denialism. And then I think, there's also that other aspect, of what fuels denialism that we also need to address.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's what you brought up earlier, where you can have the data, but you have to draw the right conclusions from it. And I think we, in modern information society, we kind of become obsessed with like getting right or like proving them wrong. And like, that's part of it. We have to have the data, we have to have the knowledge, but we also have to draw the right conclusions, and we have to, make people aware of the choices they're intentionally committing.
Mm-hmm.
And how fossil fuel industries, like you said, Jia, they really agitate or put a lot of money in places that resist those sorts of things. And the sort of relationship I've in the past, like I've mentioned, I think it was like the 1980s.
Yeah, they've known for years.
And then those same oil companies went hard at the science, discredited them, ruined their reputations when they were putting forth that data in the 1980s, and how that set us back decades. So yeah, absolutely. Something to ensure that they hear about. And I'm so glad you said that, John, too. It's not that we didn't know, it's that we made the choice.
Right.
Money and systems made the choice.
Also just add that, I just came back from a week-long conference in Anaheim. It was called the Renewable Energy Plus Conference, and it was actually the biggest energy conference in entire North America. We had a record-breaking turnout, and the emphasis during that conference was environmental justice and building generation in a way that's equitable. And it's not just about making sure that we have reliable electricity in places where most people are located. We also need to be aware we should be serving everybody, especially people who are, insecure about, the electricity and just basic, necessities, right? And so what we're seeing right now in our industry with the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are actual languages in there that are actually tackling this very issue where, certain tax incentives are being given to developers where if they are building on, say, retiring coal facilities. Number two, based on labor statistics, we're actually seeing additional tax breaks for developers who are willing to put their facilities close to underserved communities. And so that is absolutely, it just warmed my kind of tree hugger heart when I was at the conference to know that this is a legitimate thing that we're tackling right now, that we need to be mindful that we're not just serving those populated areas, but rather we should be serving everyone in equitable fashion.
Great point.
Yeah. So thank you so much. That's all I got. This is, ninth grade introduction to environmental geography, natural disasters in North America. Do you guys have anything else you want to throw in or offer about this, or anything that's said today? Do you guys want to, is there anything you need to advertise, or anything you need to put out, social media handles, projects, or anything like that?
Not at all for me. Nope.
So then I'll ask this. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I will just say that, as a message to just everybody, I think that as we continue to experience impacts of climate change, and also as we become more and more environmentally conscious, I really hope that this kind of thing gets instilled earlier, into kids, because they're our future. They're the future decision makers, and so. I hope that, kind of what we've all seen, right, in our lifetime, I hope that gets continued to be passed on in the classroom. I hope that we don't make the same mistakes, because right now we've been heading towards a very dangerous direction, and we are seeing those consequences as laid out even, from your lesson plans, right? And so, I just want to make sure, I want to impress upon our younger generations, right? And that's what you're there for, Robert. You're doing it. You're impressing on them how important geography is, and those implications, large scale, huge financial implications, on our society. And so, I think that what we're all doing is incredibly valuable, but especially, Robert, what you're doing, in terms of educating our future generations and letting them know that geography is essential and that it has a tremendous impact on our day-to-day. Like Logan said, it's everything.
Right. And I did just think of one other thing. I would say that if anybody's listening to this or has children who are considering, the one thing that really radicalized me or started my path on geography and sustainability and climate change was getting a job outdoors. Just go outdoors, and nature will radicalize you if you pay attention. If you I've worked on 3 different farms. I've worked on 3 different fire crews. Everybody there knew climate change was real. And it's just because they're outdoors. They know the crop yields are different. They know the fires are worse each year. They just pay attention because they're out in it. And if you're behind your computer, it's really hard to get an objective objective scene of this. So just go outdoors. Go talk to people who work outdoors. That's my easiest way to do it.
Go outside, kids.
Agree more.
Touch grass.
Right. Touch grass. That's right. I could not agree more.
And geography teachers couldn't do it without you guys really bringing the data and the experiences. I changed this lesson looked different 2 months ago, but we go outside and we talk to other people. And if we can't be in places, you got to find people who have been able to do that. And that's, part of the discourse of learning as well, and how we grow. So thank the both of you so much for how much you offered, not just today, this hour, but also the material you've given me to be able to update this and modify this so that we can really, throw in with these kids of just how important and necessary this is for the survival of people and our ability to thrive.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much again. We've got lots more coming for this podcast project, this YouTube series project. Thank you, Environmental Geography. Learn about it. This is the task. The material will be up on Teacher Pay Teachers. That's my little storefront there. I'll have all this material, including the links and the assets up probably when I put this video up as well. And everyone at home to remember that general ed kids deserve geography too.
Absolutely.
That's right. That's right. Awesome. Robert, thank you so much for having us.